All right, so welcome everyone. I am Mark Fowler, CEO at the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, and so excited to welcome you to this conversation with Dr. Khyati Joshi on her new book, White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. So first, I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining us. I want to offer a special thank you to our sponsor for today, the Walt Disney Company. And I also want to thank and acknowledge our partners at the Boniek Institute at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Thank you all so much for your support and for sharing about this event. I think it's important to do a land acknowledgement because it has become a bigger part of my work more recently. I am broadcasting, if you will, from my home in Flatbush, Brooklyn, which is the ancestral home of the Munsee Lenape people. I want to acknowledge that this land does not belong to me, did not belong to me, that I have benefited from the horrible devastation that's been inflicted on that community, which is now a diaspora community from its original land here in this northeastern area. So I just want to acknowledge that and ask that the ancestors would accept my plea for forgiveness, and that our work today would be seen by them as worthy. I also want to just note that we are still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that there are any number of us on the call today who are being directly impacted by the coronavirus, in addition to all of the other concerns of the day. So just wanted you to know from us at Tanenbaum that we are thinking of you. We offer our condolences for anyone that you may have lost, anyone who is still struggling with the disease or with any other ensuing ideas. And I see someone is telling me that you've lost sound. Are other people losing sound?
Okay.
Okay, so we've got a number of people hearing us. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that feedback. We appreciate it. And then what else did I want to say? I know the introductions are just killing you. But let me just say this last piece. So one of the things when George Floyd was murdered that we began to look at Tanenbaum was what could we uniquely offer during this time. And the first email, if you will, that I sent to the Tanenbaum community had to do with the paradox that exists with the unique fingerprint that religion has on the creation and the sustaining of systems of inequity and oppression, and at the same time, religious and spiritual communities who have been and are taking up anti-racism and anti-bias work at the theological level as well as the community societal level. So that paradox, if you will, is a context for us for this conversation, because we didn't get to the circumstances that we find ourselves in just over the last 4 years or since the Civil Rights Amendment. This is historical beyond just the purview of the United States. But we're going to be talking today with Dr. Khyati Joshi about where we are today in the United States in particular, and what are some of the ways forward. So just a brief introduction of Dr. Joshi, who is really just kind of now my new bestie. We just haven't had the chance to physically be in touch with one another, but you meet people periodically and your souls meet. And that is, I'm introducing you to my new friend and my new sister. Dr. Joshi is, in addition to the author of the book we'll be discussing today, White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. She is also the author and co-editor of Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice in its 3rd edition. She is also the author of New Roots in America's Sacred Ground, Religion, Race, and Ethnicity in Indian America. Envisioning Religion, Race, and Asian Americans, and Asian Americans in Dixie, Race and Migration in the South. She has presented at the White House. She has advised the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. She has been an advisor to the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life in groundbreaking research that they conducted on Asian Americans and religion. I can't read anymore. I mean, the page just kind of goes on and on. But she is also a noted panelist on MSNBC, C-SPAN, CBS 2 in New York, and a variety of radio programs as well. So welcome, Khyati. It's such a pleasure to have you with us.
I'm so happy to be here, and the feeling is mutual in terms of, and I loved what you said about, you know, when you meet someone and then your souls meet. That was just beautiful. And I also want to say how much I appreciate you honoring the land that we sit on, the Lenape. I'm coming to all y'all from northern New Jersey. You might not think it with that accent, but but I'm a proud Atlanta girl, so that's where the y'all comes from. But I'm in northern Jersey, and the Lenape were also here, and you know, they still struggle today. They have to litigate to have access to what was theirs in the first place. And so thank you for that. And it is, you know, that right there gets us into the concept of Christian privilege and white Christian privilege.
That's exactly right. And, you know, I just wanted to start this conversation, though, because I know that this work it's more than theoretical. It's more than examination of theoretical construct for you. And this has been your work for over 20 years. So I wonder if you could just share with us a bit about this deeply personal work that you're doing, and kind of why is it driven you and driven your career? I think it would be important for us to know that.
Sure. Yeah, it is. You know, the book is both a professional and intellectual project and a personal one, right? So the professional intellectual piece, as academics, we write books, right? And over the last 2 decades, we've had more and more information and resources come out helping people understand the concept of white privilege, the construction of whiteness, you know, what is it about? And I always thought something was missing, and specifically the role of Christianity in constructing whiteness, and the really looking at the intersections of race and religion. So that is why I wanted to write a book on it, because there isn't something out there that gets at this intersection. The other piece of it is personal. I, as an Indian American Hindu woman, has lived white Christian privilege my whole life. And it wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I actually had the language mark to be able to articulate the experiences I was having. And so, you know, I have a few goals for the book for readers. You know, of course, I want you to understand the argument that's laid out, but I'm really looking for helping everyone have language to better have these, to more effectively have these conversations. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I'm looking to make often what has been invisible visible. Yeah.
Yes.
So those are, you know, some of the reasons why.
Great. So I think that, you know, lexicon is really important for setting context for this conversation to achieve the goals that you're talking about. So first, from your perspective and from your research and your work, let's talk about privilege. How do you define privilege? And there's so the one thing you'll know, those of you who are watching us, is that when you get the book and start reading it, there will be moments when you want to throw it across the room, because there's so much kind of like information and revelation that kind of comes to you. You just want to fling it across the room and get it away from you. Then you got to run and pick it up. I had an iPad and I didn't want to mess up my iPad. But you talk about privilege, and you talk about the external dimension of privilege and an internal dimension of privilege. And so could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So first we have to understand what is privilege, right? And a lot of times these days, or actually over the years, when I bring up the concept of privilege, usually a lot of times people have a kind of a negative visceral reaction to it. But privilege in most cases, it's an unearned advantage because you are part of the dominant group and society has been made for you, right? So if we're talking white privilege, for example, it's a product of systemic racism. You didn't do a darn thing to have it, to earn it. It's not earned, it's unearned. But you have it because of the way whiteness has been embedded in our legal and social infrastructure, if you will, over the centuries, right? So it's a product of that. So it's the same with Christian privilege. It's a product of systemic religious oppression. Now, when the internal and external dimensions, there are ways that the external piece of it is how you have it, you don't always understand you have it, and yet you're going through life with it. And it is also affecting how society views itself. Internal dimensions are the internalized, almost the dominance that becomes internalized in someone who's Christian, if we're talking Christian privilege, where then it's hard for them to see because they're what's considered normal.
So this is a key point that I really want you to dig into a little bit more. So the whole idea of Christian normativity, which is another concept that you talk about in your book. And the book that I'm mentioning, someone asked in the chat if we could include the name of the book. Right now, we're still just talking about the primary text, White Christian Privilege by Dr. Joshi. The whole idea of Christian normativity, if you could just say a little bit more about that, because one of the things I think that's important in these conversations that sometimes gets lost, even if we're talking about white Christian privilege and then talking about whiteness, that they are constructs, and then there are white people. And I think that sometimes the three get collapsed as if they are one thing. And if you could just separate system from people.
Sure. So actually, Mark, let's talk Christian privilege, Christian normativity, and Christian hegemony. Okay,
awesome.
As a way of laying those out. And so Christian privilege is really focused on the individual level, right? Bias and privilege exists at three levels. And at the individual level, we have Christian privilege. It's what an individual has or doesn't have. Christian normativity is what exists in this at the societal level, kind of. It is where it is the language, it is the metaphors and the underlying theology that are, Christian language and Christian metaphors and the underlying theology that just become part of what's considered normal in the United States, right? This whole conversation we're having is about the United States.
Yeah.
So that it's so pervasive that it becomes hard to see.
Give us an example of this.
Christian normativity is somebody, knowing that most things will close in December, right? And if it's open, it's a surprise. Well, this is when holidays are celebrated, whether you're Christian or not. Well, that's not true, but that's kind of the sense out there often.
Great.
Okay? Christian hegemony is really looking at our national identity. It's looking at that national institutional level about how Christian ways, Christian theology have come to define what is American. And sometimes it's about just taking stock of what's happened, and then sometimes we have individuals who are in positions of leadership who are perpetuating the idea that American equals white and Christian. So another way to think of it, Christian hegemony is just business as usual. Like, well, this is just what's done. If we're talking about religion, well, there must be, all religions must have one sacred text and a holiday, two holidays that are of particular significance. And, to be religious means you go to a weekly meeting in a building, right? This is what's considered normal. The normal way of praying. What is that? Well, it's sitting in a pew with, you know, like to me, it feels like I'm in a chair, right? And feet down, hands folded, praying, listening, right? That's not prayer the way I grew up as a Hindu. That's kind of considered the normal way of praying. And the reason it's so important for us to think about what's considered normal and what's not, because when something is othered, it's not just othered, it's looked at less than, it's looked at as less sacred, less religious, and so on.
So I think one of the things that's really interesting is that when we've done our work in education and workplaces, healthcare, and all of our constituent groups, one of the things that we do talk about is that dynamic of stereotyping and distinguishing between the process that the brain engages in where it orders information. But then when we talk about stereotyping, we're talking about the value that is placed on people or groups, as opposed to just kind of where do they fit in the construct of my mind. And I love what you're saying about kind of business as usual, and not just looking at someone as other, but less than. And that is the dynamic that we're speaking about.
Right. And that's what happens, whether folks realize it or not.
So one of the things that you bring up in the book, and I think is an important conversation as well, is this idea of white Christian privilege, and then Christian privilege, and how if you are a Christian and maybe not white, that there is a unique experience of Christian privilege for you. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yes, sometimes we're talking Christian privilege, sometimes we're talking white privilege, and sometimes we're talking white Christian privilege, right? Because Asian Christians, Hispanic Christians, Black Christians have Christian privilege. This is where, you know, we have to identify our various social identities, look at them sometimes singularly and then other times intersectionally, because we are more than just one identity, right? But you know, for example, Indian Christian friends have Christian privilege, right? They know if you will, the secret handshake and the code words. They get their holidays off, right? They don't have to explain that piece. At the same time, though, they're people of color. And, you know, race has affected all aspects of society, continues to every day, and has for the last 3-4 centuries in this country, right? So you can't, at a certain level, you can't take race out of it. But then we also have to understand our friends, for example, who are racially white and religious minorities, for example, our Jewish friends, right? They face anti-Semitism. They face Christian privilege, right? They don't have privilege when it comes to religion. So it's important to splice those identities out.
Great, thank you. And so we've got a number of stakeholders, as I've said. Tanenbaum does its work in education. We do our work with workplaces, in the healthcare industry, and in diplomacy and peace building. And you have a number of examples in your book that speak to almost each one of our constituents groups. So I wondered if you could share a couple of anecdotes about the ways in which the impact of white Christian privilege, let's just start with schools, with like maybe the K through 12 school system and that experience. What are some of the examples of what students face in navigating white Christian privilege, even not knowing what the language is or what's going on?
Well, I'll talk about it with students, and then I'll talk about it vis-a-vis teachers, because that gets at some of the workplace issues also, okay? So students often, you know, most school districts in our country, I should say many school districts in our country allow for excused absences on religious holidays. But one of the impacts of the presence of Christian privilege, and especially when it's not acknowledged as a structural issue, is that sometimes the religious minority, the kids, they don't want to take off. Because, you know, when you miss a day, the rest of the world is still going on. And so they come back behind, I've had students say to me that, well, it's almost like double or triple the work. So I'd rather just not miss and just go to school. So, but what are the consequences of that? The consequences of that is not celebrating a particular holiday with your family. And traditions get lost, stories get lost, right? So there's a long-term impact of that. And I'll give another story. I had a couple of students who were doing their internship in schools, and it was just about this time of year and around the Jewish High Holy Days. And the students, my student teachers, let's just call them interns so it doesn't get confusing, the language. The interns came back to me and said, Professor Joshi, we have a problem. We have a couple of kids who are Jewish, who are, observing Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, and the teachers are making comments like in the faculty room or elsewhere, not in front of the students, like, well, I don't know why that kid is staying home. Their family's not very Jewish, right? And these were teachers who are Christian, right? And so just, the teachers aren't acknowledging how they're defining religiosity a certain way. They may not be even aware of it, right? Now, what's the impact of that when the Jewish student stays home from school to observe Yom Kippur, right? And then, let's say, needs extra help after school. You think those teachers are really wanting to be there? Like, right, there's attitudinal impact.
Going back to the privilege that idea of the internal dimension.
Exactly, right. And so, when teachers or managers, directors in workplaces, being aware of how are you defining, because you are, who's religious, who's not, what's your way of defining it, right? And this is impact research methodology. I mean, how is religiosity measured sometimes? The number of times you attend weekly worship. Well, that's not the thing in some religions, right? So that's how some of the ways it's played out.
Wow. And what's interesting is that I want to pull a little bit on this thread. So in some of the trainings that we do, one of the activities that we have done with a number of workplaces is the traveler's profile. And it basically gives an opportunity for people to self-assess their own ways in which they think about religion in the workplace and religiosity. And it allows them to kind of come up with a composite, not solely, but what's the general way in which you think about religion in the workplace? And we then engage people, well, if that is the general way in which you think about religion in the workplace, how then are you evaluating your colleagues and people that report to you? And what might be some of the implicit bias that you had that you don't even know is kind of operating in the background? And I do think you're bringing up a really critical point, that there is this experience that we're having, but we may not be giving language to it. And we may not be speaking about it in detail that allows us to take action on it.
Yeah. And, a kind of a national example also that comes up is the issue of, and we can talk about this vis-a-vis Native American spirituality. We can talk about this vis-a-vis Hinduism, Sikhism, Jains. The idea that land is considered sacred, right? So that idea doesn't exist in Protestant faiths, in Christianity in general. So it's often not seen as really sacred or religious, which is why we have pipelines being built over sacred land. But we wouldn't, people have no, companies and even our government has no problem, raising a piece of land to build something, but they wouldn't do that to a cemetery, right? Because it's understood the sacred nature of that cemetery. I think it's hard sometimes for people to understand, what do you mean a mountain is sacred? What is land is sacred? I think a lot of people do understand it, but people who are in positions of power, of being able to make decisions, needing to understand there are a variety of ways we think about this.
Yeah. So we talked about where we were going to go off script. So yeah, I want to play devil's advocate. I want to offer some potential responses to some of the things that you said, and maybe we can go a little bit deeper into the idea. So for the student who opts to not observe their tradition, to not ask for an excused absence, and to come in and go to school, go to class, take a test. I'm a former public high school teacher in New York City, and this kind of comes up around standardized exams as well in terms of where they fall and who gets excused, et cetera. So someone could say, well, then maybe their tradition is not that important to them, or that these are the kinds of sacrifices people have to make if they want to be American, if they want to be here. How do you respond?
Well, I respond by saying that they are defining American in a certain way, which is happening more and more as our days go on. And I think for educators particularly, or anyone who wants to understand, I'm biased towards educators as a teacher educator, but for folks who actually want to understand, what I have found, Mark, is having the conversation and bringing in the fact that sometimes folks who are religious minorities have just learned how to deal with it, right? Particularly those who are also then immigrants. You don't want to create ruckus, you don't want to create problems, you just deal with it, and that's just it's a coping mechanism, because it takes a lot of energy to put forth, oh, I'm going to do X or Y. And especially when we're talking about kids in high school, some have the wherewithal to want to say something. Others are being told by parents, in many cases immigrant parents, that don't create problems, just stay focused on the work. So there's so many other factors that go into it. The other thing is that for whether we're talking an adolescent person or an adult, it does take a fair amount of chutzpah, if you will, to be able to say, look, I need to do this, and here's why, when someone is, resisting you being able to do X, Y, or Z. Sometimes it's easier just to back off, because they also don't know how to make this argument. They may even want to. So it shouldn't get interpreted that, well, they don't care or they're not that religious. There's actually a variety of other factors that can go into it.
So we're going to even go further off script, because I think that this is a really important point, and it definitely has come up in the work. And I know that there are a number of diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners joining us today. So in that dynamic where you don't maybe necessarily, there are not a lot of requests coming in for accommodations around religion. There's an assumption that there's not a need for one. What's the metaphor? What are the shoes we want somebody to step into to understand that experience, that there's something that would really benefit me as either an accommodation or an acknowledgement? How do we get people to step into each other's shoes to understand the barriers that someone may be experiencing to asking for an accommodation? How do we do that?
Well, one of the ways to do that is for folks to, so I should say that while I live in the academic world, I actually also do trainings, right? And so I'm very practical about it. And I think one of the best ways is for people to do reflection and activities as managers, to take a look at their own various social identities, because most of us have advantages where we are at an advantage in United States society and when we are at a disadvantage.
Yes.
And that's a really important skill, because then you're kind of, I'm heterosexual. Okay. So society's been made for me. I don't think about it. I got married, everybody was excited, so on and so on, right? But so I don't know exactly what my gay and lesbian friends, bisexual friends face, right? But I do know the obstacles that were in my way when I was actually trying to get married in Atlanta, Georgia, and having a ceremony, and the obstacles we faced, right? So it
Yeah.
gives me a sense of what it feels like when you face obstacles. So that's first and foremost, is
Right.
engaging in reflection and activities that get you to look at advantaged and disadvantaged identities.
That's great. And, you know, and I just want to acknowledge, I see that someone has a question that they put in, and they're just a little bit more we're going to do, and then we're going to get to your questions. And there was one in the chat. I'm just going to ask that person who put their question in the chat, could you put that in the Q&A section so I don't miss it? So thank you so much for that. So I just want you to check, because you know, this was another one of those moments where I wanted to throw your book across the room. When I was reading the story of you putting your wedding together and trying to find a place. And then, you know, again, from the perspective of being a good corporate social citizen, but also not leaving money on the table, because I kind of felt like I wish I was still catering at that time when you were looking for a place for 500 people. So could you just tell a little bit, could you tell that story quickly about what
Sure.
you and your husband were looking for and the nature of your wedding?
Sure. So I'm part of an interfaith, interreligious family. I'm Hindu. My husband is a white Christian Episcopalian. And we wanted to have a blended ceremony. We decided to have it in a quote unquote religiously neutral location, a hotel, ballroom, not a Hindu temple or a church. And we had a Christian minister and a Hindu priest officiating together. It took a lot of work, but it did work. And so we were looking for hotel ballrooms, and this was going to be a pretty, fairly large wedding. I'm the first in my family to get married, and so on and so on. So we went to some of the major hotels in Atlanta. You can name the big chains, and that's where we went. And we were told the following. One was, so there's white privilege coming in and Christian privilege coming in here, both. We were told that they would not allow outside catering and that they would cook the Indian food. And, my mom was like, yeah, right. Okay. Then we were told at one major hotel chain that the dry cleaning bill for the linens after one wedding was so high, they kind of decided to stay away. Now, this was before our iPhone, because I would have just loved to have recorded that. But the one that's really central to our conversation is that all of these places we went, we would talk about the ritual and what we were doing. And in the Hindu ceremony, there is a havan. There is a small fire. Fire is really important in Hinduism for purification. And we would say that, and people did not bother asking, oh, well, what does that look like? How big is it? How long does it need to be there for? What's the duration that the fire will be lit? No, they heard fire. I think they imagined a big bonfire mark in the middle of a massive ballroom and then said no. We
Right.
were turned away from the biggest hotels in Atlanta, Georgia. Another thing that happened was that at one place, my mom and dad and I went, and my husband, John, well, my fiance at the time was there. My parents would ask questions. They would look at John and answer them. So just completely, folks with accents, invisible.
Right.
And it was pretty
Right.
clear who was footing the bill.
Right.
Finally, we were able to have the wedding at a hotel, and it was owned by an Indian Muslim man who was somewhat familiar with the things that need to happen in an Indian wedding. He's like, we can do this. He's like, I'm going to call the fire marshal or the fire chief, and we're going to talk to him. They talked. The fire chief said, you know what, we're going to stay on standby for 45 minutes. We're going to turn off the sprinkler system, and we'll be fine. They were willing to find a way. All of these
Right.
other places did not understand the sacred nature of the fire piece, nor did they bother to find out.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that, because I think that really, your personal story gets to so many of the points that we're talking about, and it also kind of speaks to the nature of what we're trying to do. So there are in the end of the book, there are some recommendations that you make for how we can actually think about addressing these topics and moving forward. So I want to just screen share, if I can find it. I'm going to screen share your slide here, because I think that it would be important for us to talk about how do we move forward, because we know the situation we find ourselves in, but how do we move forward? So could you just talk a little bit about this building a more perfect union and these ideas that we can incorporate to change?
Sure. So I lay out a blueprint, about changing these 5 items, and I provide a couple of examples. I'm not going to provide an example for each one. I'll focus on a couple, but it'll give folks an idea. And I will say that what I'm really hoping is to hear from readers how they've taken any one of these pieces and used it in their community. So let's go with change the questions, because that's a really, there's a 2-parter there. There's the micro level and the macro level. And the micro level here is, instead of asking somebody, oh, well, what's your Christmas? Or what's your Bible, right? It's coming from a good place, but it's still very Christian normative, right? Well, as a Hindu, I've been asked these questions 1,001 times, right? And when I was younger, I kind of was really confused, like, how do I respond? Because you know what? First of all, I wasn't very familiar with the Bible, okay, as a Hindu. But putting that aside, there are religions that have multiple sacred scripture, not just one. There are some that have no sacred scripture, right? But it is privileging this idea of Bible. What's your Christmas? Same concept. Instead, asking somebody, well, what's the most significant holiday for you in terms of your faith, right? Rephrasing these questions. And then going back to the scripture one, well, what do you have sacred scripture in your faith? It can be something as simple as that. So that's the rephrasing at the micro level. The macro level is one of the questions I've always had is, who's gotten to define the moral questions of our country? And it's been a conservative Christian movement. Why isn't, it's the issue of homosexuality and abortion that are seen as the moral questions of our country. Why not environmental justice? Can you imagine what it might be like if for the last 50 years or 70 years we've been paying attention to environmental justice, which I think is a moral question for so many of us, right? So changing the questions, we can't go with the questions that are out there. We're gonna need to change them if we're going to work for justice in these areas. And remember, a lot of times people think, well, wait a minute, we have freedom of religion in the First Amendment, and look at all the religious faiths that are here, we're one of the most religiously diverse countries on the planet. The presence of religious diversity does not mean that there is equity and justice, right?
I'm gonna stop you right there, because there's gold and then there are hills. Just repeat what you just said.
Sure. So we have to make a distinction between diversity and justice. So yes, we have a lot of religious diversity, and specifically in some parts of the country more than others, right? But that doesn't mean that every community can build a house of worship of their faith. Indeed, we have so many stories across our country, synagogues, Hindu temples, mosques, that faced a tremendous amount of opposition when the communities were trying to erect their particular house of worship.
And actually legislation that had to be enacted to protect that process.
That's right. So we have to make a distinction between the presence of diversity and the presence of equity and justice. So we could go with change foundational assumptions. I'll give you what I mean there, an example. So I am a proponent of saying Merry Christmas. I think in December, I always want to wish my friends who are Christian a Merry Christmas. I know that as a Hindu and celebrating Diwali, it's lovely when someone knows my holiday and says it that way. I understand why Happy Holidays doesn't sound the same to someone who's Christian. What I am advocating is that we all then also have to learn, and this involves religious literacy, we also have to be able to wish people a Eid Mubarak, right? A Hag Sameach. right? A happy Diwali, and so on. So
Yes.
that's going to take some work, but I am fully 100% behind Merry Christmas.
Great, 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 great. So I think this might be a good time then for us to maybe start looking at some of the questions that have been coming in.
Okay, I'll let you field them to us. How's that?
Absolutely. So I'll just ask for those of you who have questions, if you want, you can start putting them in the Q&A box. I'm going to just take them in the order in which they came in. So the first question that I have is, how do visual images add to or subtract from privilege, i.e., an image of a white Jesus in Christian churches and private homes?
Well, I think it depends on the context, right? For some, first of all, home is one thing. A home is your home, you know, and I think you should put up that which speaks to you. Absolutely, right? In the workplace setting, in a more public setting, we have to think about the context, right? And, you know, I think that taking into account and having these conversations on why is it always white Jesus? Why is the depiction of God? I mean, here's the cover of my book, and the cover is, you know, the famous painting from Michelangelo's painting from the Sistine Chapel. You know, why is it that God has always been depicted this way? I think we have to have those conversations when images of a white Jesus are going to remain in the public square. And, you know, when there's pushback, if there's other images that are introduced, you know, why is that pushback happening? For the last 50 years, for the most part, we're just sidestepping these conversations in the hopes that they're going to go away. And I think, you know, folks are realizing they're not. We're going to have to deal with them.
Yeah, absolutely. So one question I can answer is that, Maria, there will be a replay available. We are recording this session and we will be sharing it out with everyone. So you will certainly get that as soon as it's available. Our next question is, do other countries have the homogeny concept, like brown Hindus in India, Muslim privilege or Hindu privilege in other countries? How would you address that?
Oh, yes. You know, the kind of conceptual framework for my book comes from the work of Paulo Freire, amazing educator in Sao Paulo. He wrote a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, for those who are interested. And the reason that framework speaks to me is that it can be used anywhere in the country. So in the United States, I don't have, you know, privilege as a Indian American Hindu. I do as a heterosexual, right? If we have to compare apples to apples. So we have to look at other secular democracies, because the United States is a secular democracy. So actually a really good comparison is India. India also officially has no state religion, but it is as Hindu as the United States is Christian. I certainly have Hindu privilege when I am in India. We can't make the same comparison to Saudi Arabia or to Israel, because Israel says it's a Jewish state. Saudi Arabia is an Islamic state. So we have to look at the, you know, governmental constitutional structures to actually make the right comparisons.
Thank you. So our next question is, US society and workplaces in particular are increasingly secular, with some environments even considering religions, including Christianity, as suspect. Do you see a shift in Christian privilege in these contexts? And do you have any language or insight you could share to help us understand and talk about the privileging of the absence of specific religious beliefs or commitments?
I think I'm understanding the question. Let's see if I do. Well, there's two things that come to mind. I think first we have to acknowledge that, you know, Christian privilege and white Christian privilege isn't going away because you've said that we're not going to bring it into the workplace. It is part of the legal and social infrastructure of this country. And so even when Pew, you know, puts out data that shows Christianity is on the decline in the United States, that is not taking away what's been built into law and public policy. So that's really important to understand. The second piece of this is that we also have to acknowledge that in certain segments of our society, there is a bias against religion, straight out, right? And colleges and the university, as a professor, I can say that, yeah, it is one. If you're religious, you're seen as anti-intellectual, right? And, in many cases, if you're a Christian, but actually I've experienced that sentiment even as a Hindu. So there is a bias against religion in our in certain segments of our society, and we have to take note of that.
And I think if I could, I would just add, in terms of what we're seeing at Tanenbaum, is that we definitely see more companies, both our corporate members and others, who are looking at the religion as a dimension of identity that must be included in the conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. What I would say, though, is that even with that acknowledgement and with those companies doing that great work, that there still is the tension sometimes between whether we should address religion at all.
Yeah.
If thinking about an employee resource group, like, can we just have a Christian group, or should we have an interfaith group? I think, if we were to look at all of these questions through the lens of white Christian privilege, that might give us, again, to your point, different questions to ask about if our intention and our goal is equity, inclusion, and belonging, then what is the right group for us to form?
Yes, absolutely. That's really important. And I think that what is your objective is, that if that's what's guiding your work, that's important. I think it is a mistake, though, to leave religion out, because folks will say, well, we're supposedly, well, aren't we, what about separation of church and state? I mean, right there, you realize there needs to be a lot of education that happens, because that's a phrase that was used a long time ago, and then it was put away and not brought out again, if you will, until the 1950s. Okay, in a Supreme Court decision. And I think, there's so much miseducation, Mark, around religion and what has really happened in this country, that we've got to start with some I don't want to say basic education, but some fundamental education, so people understand and can get back to this idea of what about separation of church and state.
And I think, you said it, you spoke to it earlier, but we really are talking about not just religious literacy of a tradition, but religious literacy around the presence of religion, the participation of religion in the creation of systems, the legal system, the educational system, the way in which we work, how we provide care to people, what are acceptable levels, all of that. I think that may be a distinction that we've not looked at very closely.
Okay. And I think the other thing that can help in workplaces and like kind of every day on the ground is to think about the concept of lived religion, right? Lived religion is not Wikipedia religion, in the sense that, it's understanding that there are contradictions and conflicting things. You may know, well, with Islam, you do X, Y, and Z. And now all of a sudden you have an employee who's not doing those things, but still saying they're Muslim, and therefore it's causing you confusion. Well, the concept of lived religion, how religion appears in people's everyday lives, I have found is a good way to get your head around what's going on.
That's great. So our next question is, how do you distinguish who you would greet in that way during the holiday season? To be respectful to their preferred religion, is there a proper way to inquire?
That's an excellent question. And usually the pushback I get, first of all, I will say on this, is like, well, how can you expect someone at the Gap to know what religion you are? And well, I'm actually not speaking to the retail piece. I'm speaking much closer in our lives. We have people who are our supervisors, who are our colleagues, and we don't know what to say. And so we go to happy holidays. So this first is going to go back to, well, who's part of your network? You know, where do you have authentic relationships? Because then the kind of questions you ask are different. In some cases, you'll know, right? Then there's the next level out, you know, and a way to ask is that, you know, are there celebrations coming up in the next few months that are sacred for you, that you'll be observing, that I'd like to know about, you know, because I don't want to assume, right?
Right.
What happens sometimes, I'll tell you, one rule to remember is stay away from the shortcut. We're often too much wanting to, what's the shortest way to ask? What's abbreviate everything, you know? We cut everything down. Twitter is what, you know, 270 characters, right? All that. This takes a little time. This takes a little thought, right? But just saying, I'd like to know, and, you know, I know there's a variety of holidays coming up over the next few months. Are there any that speak to you? Are there any that you'll be observing?
Mm-hmm. That's great. We also have one in our tips for our concepts for respectful communication, or competencies for respectful communication. One of the things that we always encourage people is that acknowledge and apologize for mistakes made. Because, you know, simply because you do it the first time doesn't mean like it's going to be perfect. And it's okay to muck it up, but just don't leave it mucky. Actually, like, clean it up. And if it is that you have offended someone unintentionally, to actually acknowledge, you know, I really apologize. I really want to just make sure that we're taking care of you, that I'm taking care of your needs as a member of my team. Let me try again.
Yeah.
And to your point about the shortcut, we have to build capacity around these issues.
And these are skills. These are skills, you know, and you're going to mess up. I always say, how many times did we learn our multiplication tables?
Right.
How many times did we learn them? And then you still make mistakes.
Right, right.
It's the same thing. This is a skill, and that's how it needs to be looked at and practiced.
So we have a couple more questions and not as much time, so I want to try and do the speed round.
Okay.
This is actually from Dr. Zara Jamal, who is one of our, at Boniek Institute, and one of our partners and sponsors for this event. How can workplaces and schools address the lifetime of and continuing trauma experienced by the oppressed who are not white and Christian?
Oh my gosh. And you gave me this for lightning round. I think, you know, one of the most important things, and let me say, I appreciate this question as someone who's living with that, is that conveying that there are long-term effects, and conveying to the religious minorities that you're gonna need, you'll think you'll have conquered it, and it'll pop up again, right? That's the piece of trauma there. So that's one, I think, really important thing. I think getting religious minorities to understand what they're experiencing is so critical. I didn't understand it for the longest time until I went to graduate school. And I think for the larger society, it's this continued reflection. I mean, of course I want folks to read, and of course I want folks to read the book, but it's got to be more than that. It's about engaging. It's about trying and knowing you're going to mess up. But the trauma piece of it is helping folks understand that this is going to affect you for the long term, and how to cope with that. Mm-hmm. That's the quickest way I can think of, Mark.
Great, thank you. I know. There are a couple more questions, and I don't think that, I apologize, we may not get to them all. So let me ask this question, and this may be our last question of our time together. And of course, we're going to find ways to do more stuff. How can Christians better welcome and serve people from different faiths?
Having authentic relationships, whether it's across, communities, or we're talking at the individual level and in one's own lives. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is that and it's part of the blueprint. It is that we can't just see commonalities. And I know that Tanenbaum, you all do this. We have to see commonalities and differences.
Yes.
Right. And those differences are often, we don't get to those because that's what gets people nervous. But actually, that's where the magic happens, when you can actually engage in those conversations. And I think it also has to be from Christian communities understanding Christian privilege. Real quick, I was invited to speak to a church in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I got to the church and I asked the minister, and we had many planning meetings. And I said, okay, well, where am I talking from? And he's like, up there. And I said, are you sure? He's like, absolutely. And I spoke about Christian privilege from the pulpit. It sent the message that we've got to address this and acknowledge this. I am, as a Hindu, I am part of the Episcopalian community. Before COVID, many Sunday mornings you would find me in church because I'm in part of an interfaith family. And I think, I look forward, Mark, to working with actually Christian communities and churches and groups on this issue. That's a particular thing of mine in my heart.
Great. So I'm sorry, we're not going to get to all of the questions. I will say there's someone who asked a question: how has religion served as a rationale for slavery or the oppression of people? It's a bigger question than we actually have time for, but Dr. Joshi does address this question in the book. So I would encourage you to purchase the book. And I would simply say that if you look into the theology, look into your own theology, and you will find those answers. The curse of Ham, et cetera, and that the foundational conversation that we had about Christian normativity is not new today. This is something that has been going on. It was the reason why indigenous people here in the Americas were displaced from their land, because they were other than, different from, and less than the people who came. So we will certainly continue to explore this topic. Khyati, I just want to ask you, there was one last thing I know you wanted to say about your hope for the work and your hope for the book. So I want to give you that minute and then I'll close us out.
Sure. Well, my hope is that this helps people see what has been invisible, and now the book has helped make it visible. Actually, chapter 2 and 3 gets to the history and law stuff that I think it makes the case for how this and where this exists, this being Christian normativity, Christian hegemony, and Christian privilege. And I really hope to hear from people. Actually, if you can put up the slide, my contact information, I really hope to hear from people how they use the book. I'm already hearing from people, and it's so rewarding because the book was written to show everyone what's been invisible, and then people use this in their communities. It's not something I want just sitting on your bookshelf or in your brain, but it is about using it in your community. And so please also let me know how you do that. And those are my GPS points on social media.
Great.
So thank you, Mark, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I think we could talk for hours. I am so excited about all the projects that we might be doing together, and I look forward to more conversations.
Absolutely. So thank you.
Thank you,
my friend. I just also want to share Tanenbaum's social media handles. Please be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Tanenbaum Center, and on Facebook and LinkedIn, we're the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. And please don't forget to use the hashtag #IncludeReligion, all one word. I want to thank you, my new and dear friend, for spending this time with us. It has been such a rich conversation, certainly much more to discuss. I'm sure we will find good ways to continue this conversation and to do good work. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Again, our thanks to the Walt Disney Company for their support of this series, and to our colleagues at Rice University, the Boniek Institute at Rice University, for your support. Thank you all so much for being with us, and we will see you the next time. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.